Imagine you're a pilot, low on fuel, circling your home the carrier, watching the deck below like a lifeline you can't reach. Your fuel needle crawls towards zero. Planes pile up on the runway like cars in a freeway crash. One snapped wire, one blown tire, one misjudged approach, and the whole deck is a coffin. Pilots hover, helpless, while the carrier that was supposed to protect them becomes the deadliest trap in the ocean. It's absurd. It's merciless. And it's all caused by a single design flaw, one that turned naval aviation's greatest asset into its greatest liability. This is the story of how a simple line of paint solved an impossible problem. 1945. For a pilot returning to the USS Enterprise, the 872-foot runway below isn't a safe haven. It's a one-way street in the sky. You line up, hook the wire, and then you stop literally. There's no go-around, no quick turn. Each plane that lands must be caught, brought to a halt, and physically shoved and shuffled out of the way before the next aircraft can even think about coming in. The deck looks compact from above 5 or 6 aircraft, wingtip to wingtip, but up close, it's chaos. Fuel, ordnance, men, machines packed so tight that one small mistake shuts everything down. For a pilot low on fuel, that's a death sentence. The clock is ticking. Each landing is a fragile, 90-second operation, barely time to hook a wire, come to a stop, and clear the deck. With 30 planes circling overhead, schedules collapse into a single countdown. One misstep, and those 90 seconds become an eternity. Fuel bleeds away while pilots wait, and the margin for error vanishes. And then one mistake, snapped arresting wire, blown tire, misjudged approach, turns the deck into a cork. A single stalled landing folds across the runway. Planes can't roll past. The recovery lane is locked. Operations stop on a dime. Pilots on final, with minutes of fuel, suddenly face a closed runway. Chaos isn't slow. It happens in an instant. When the deck goes dark, the pilots above become passengers on a countdown. Needles creep toward empty. Radios crackle with short, terrified updates. There's no second runway. No quick detour. One blocked plane turns the whole carrier into an impossible island. You can picture it. Jets spiraling, engines whining, fuel meters ticking away like a metronome. Options thin fast. Try one risky approach and hope for a miracle. Bail out and pray the life raft opens. Or push on and ditch into cold, indifferent water. For many, in that shrinking window, a clogged deck isn't just an inconvenience, it's a death sentence. Even a flawless recovery is a logistical nightmare. Planes cram the deck, parked wingtip to wingtip like cars in a demolition derby, fully armed, soaked in aviation fuel, bombs chained and ready. Any small mistake turns that parking lot into an inferno and a physical choke point. There's nowhere to go, no quick shuffle, no parallel runway. One snapped wire or blown tire can lock the whole ship, and every pilot still circling above out of luck. The carrier is effectively paralyzed. A single mishap turns the deck into a traffic jam that can't be undone in minutes, only with hours of savage, patient work. Crews crawl across wings and catwalks, choking the flight deck as they wrestle fueled armed planes into new positions. Each toe is delicate, every bolt checked twice. It can take up to 90 minutes to clear enough room for one more launch. 90 minutes of radio silence, of pilots circling on empty tanks, of the ship's pride sitting helpless while the enemy watches. The Queen of the Seas becomes, for a terrifying stretch, a sitting duck. Admiral Mark Mitcher put a name to the sickness, the deck cycle problem. It sounds clinical, almost small, but what he meant was catastrophic, an efficiency so rotten that the world's most powerful weapon could, at best, mount one major strike in a day. Picture a floating airport that jams itself every few landings, a machine that hands its enemies a predictable window and hands pilots a roulette wheel with fuel gauges. That one phrase captured the paradox of carrier warfare. Immense destructive potential, shackled by a single, repeatable failure mode that turned strategic dominance into a fragile, time-bound gamble. This wasn't just a weakness, it was a fatal flaw, an Achilles heel hiding in plain sight on the world's most powerful warships. One snapped wire, one blown tire, one misjudged approach, and the flight deck flipped from runway to death trap, sealing the fate of pilots, planes, and a carrier's striking power. It didn't just slow operations. It created predictable, exploitable windows when a whole task force could be paralyzed. That danger wasn't theoretical. It would be cruelly exposed in the war's opening shots. Smoke, confusion, and a lesson that would haunt naval commanders on both sides. Pearl Harbor slammed the carrier's striking power into the public imagination. Squadrons launching off a floating runway, bombs raining down, a nation stunned. But beneath the headlines and the raw spectacle was a darker truth. Those same decks that unleashed devastation were fragile bottlenecks. Planes returning with full tanks and live ordnance had nowhere to be moved. One mishap could freeze the entire deck. The attack didn't just show what carriers could do, it exposed what could go terribly wrong. That hidden vulnerability, revealed in the opening salvo, would haunt naval thinkers and force a rethinking of the carrier's very design. Japanese Admiral Nagumo had to call off a third, potentially war-ending strike. It sounds almost unbelievable until you hear why. The carrier decks were jammed with returning planes from the first two waves, parked nose to tail, fueled and armed, leaving no room to rearm and relaunch. Planes sat helpless while the chance to finish America off slipped away. It wasn't poor judgment alone. It was a design problem turned strategic catastrophe, a fragile recovery cycle that could stop a fleet in its tracks. That missed window didn't just cost an attack, it foreshadowed a much darker consequence to come. The ultimate price for this flaw was paid in blood and fire at Midway in 1942, when 4 Japanese carriers found themselves hamstrung by the very deck cycle that made them killers. Their flight decks were a waking nightmare, aircraft stacked, tanks full, bombs being hoisted, crews scrambling every inch a tinderbox. American dive bombers arrived at that moment of maximum vulnerability, and in minutes those proud ships were ripped open, fuel-fed infernos tearing through wings and hangars, decks collapsing under blast and flame. A design weakness became a catastrophe. Hundreds died. Japan's carrier strike force was shattered, and naval warfare was forever changed. Their decks were a perfect storm of vulnerability. Rows of planes parked wingtip to wingtip, veins of fuel lines snaking between them, stacks of high-explosive bombs piled and ready, crews rushing to rearm and refuel in a frantic, practiced choreography. One stray spark, one ruptured tank, one dropped wrench could turn the whole ship into a furnace. You could feel the danger in the air, a hot metallic tang of gasoline and cordite, an invisible countdown ticking down under every polished wing. In that instant, the carriers stopped being floating fortresses and became floating powder kegs, primed to blow. Then the sky filled with American dive bombers, arriving at the exact instant those powder keg decks were most exposed. They dove like iron rain, precision, speed, no mercy, each bomb finding fuel lines, munitions pits, and parked fighters as if they were targets on a range. In minutes, the proud Japanese carriers were transformed, towering columns of smoke, flight decks erupting in orange, planes breaking apart and feeding the blaze, floating infernos belching flame into the Pacific. Men on the decks had no time to fight. Ships of steel and flame rolled and sank. The carnage burned a lesson into naval minds that would not be forgotten. Midway didn't just sink ships. It seared a lesson into every flag office and wardroom across the globe. The deck cycle was a killer. Commanders who had watched carriers turn into floating tinderboxes stopped seeing air operations as glamorous choreography and started seeing a single, terrifying bottleneck where everything could, and did, go wrong. Plans were rewritten, briefings grew grim, and engineers and admirals began measuring risk in minutes of recovery time instead of tons of ordnance. Whoever could break that choke point, whoever could make a carrier keep flying while it recovered, would not just win battles, they would rewrite naval power itself. The Navy answered with brute force. Bigger carriers, more hangar space, heavier punch, everything scaled up, but they were still built on the same broken 1,925 geometry, a straight, centerline deck that offered no escape lane and no way to launch and recover at the same time. In short, capacity grew while the deck's fatal bottleneck stayed exactly the same. They poured steel and engines into ever bigger carriers, but under the shiny deck, the same 1,925 geometry festered. It's like anchoring a modern skyscraper to a log cabin foundation. Bigger ships. Same deadly bottleneck. Add more planes and the deck cycle problem doesn't disappear, it multiplies. More landings, more fuel, more ordnance packed into the same narrow flow. Each new aircraft makes the choke point more lethal. What looks like strength on paper is actually growing fragility in practice, and that mounting danger wasn't theoretical for long, it was building toward a very public catastrophe. In the Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944, the flaw stops being academic and becomes unmistakable, a fleet-wide, logistical collapse that turns the ocean into a holding pattern. Pilots circle with empty tanks, decks jam with armed, immobile planes. Commanders watch their striking power evaporate as a recovery system built for peacetime simply cannot cope with the pressure of war. It takes a staggering 97 minutes to recover 226 aircraft across the fleet, nearly an hour and a half of pure airborne limbo. The sky above the carriers becomes a chaotic swarm, fighters and bombers circling like tethered birds, fuel gauges inching toward empty, pilots watching their lives tick down in decimal points. Below, the deck is a clogged, flaming puzzle planes lined wingtip to wingtip, crews racing, tractors shunting, radio calls a frantic metronome. Every approach is a bet against time and machinery. One snapped wire or a stuck wheel and the whole system freezes, and those pilots up there have nowhere left to turn. After a brutal 97-minute backlog and a sky choked with waiting planes, dozens of pilots watch their fuel gauges creep into the red. There is no runway, there is no mercy. With nothing left, they cut throttle and send their multi-million-dollar fighters into the sea, praying for a rescue boat. Men come home, machines do not. It's desperation writ across the Pacific, a costly failure of logistics. It looked hopeless physics, fuel, and finite deck space forming a closed equation with no solution. Planes circled, pilots watched gauges tick toward empty, and every failed recovery felt like a slow-motion verdict. Yet halfway around the world, necessity was working a different angle. The Royal Navy, smaller ships, tighter decks, and fewer resources meant they had to improvise where the Americans had hit a wall. What began as small, practical experiments, tweaks to parking and approach paths born of constraint, not theory, would quietly produce the first glimmers of a genuine fix. Across the Atlantic, the first piece of the puzzle was being found. Across the Atlantic, while American carriers grappled with a choke point they couldn't fix, the much smaller decks of the Royal Navy were fighting the same deadly traffic jam, and one pragmatic officer decided to stop waiting for a miracle. Captain Matthew Slattery began tinkering with geometry, offsetting the landing path, experimenting with a canted strip that nudged approaches off the ship's centerline. He painted lines, timed landings, watched jets flirt with a new lane. At first it was crude and cautious, but each successful roll-on and safe bolter whispered a powerful possibility. Maybe the solution wasn't more room, but a smarter angle. Captain Matthew Slattery's early trials with a slightly offset or canted landing lane began as a practical shuffle. Move the touchdown area a few degrees to port, and parked aircraft that once blocked the centerline could sit out of the way. The tests proved a revealing truth. A plane doesn't always need the ship's exact center to find a safe foothold. It was an elegant, promising idea, but also a partial one. It eased the parking logjam without fixing the worst-case failures: a missed wire, a blown tire, the faster, heavier jets coming next, so the solution was real, but not yet complete. While the Navy kept trying bigger decks and new procedures, a very different mind was at work far from the hangar doors. Dennis Campbell was a civilian physicist. No uniform, no doctrine, just equations and curiosity. And he looked at the carrier like an engineer looks at a congested bridge. He stopped seeing airplanes and sailors and started seeing flows, cues, collisions, bottlenecks. In a flash of clarity, he reframed the problem entirely, not as a pilot skill issue, but as a systems problem about routing and space. That shift in perspective would turn a naval headache into a solvable engineering puzzle. Dennis Campbell doesn't tinker with hydraulics or catapults. He reimagines the whole deck. Instead of a single runway where arrivals and departures collide, he pictures a railway junction, separate tracks, clear directions, traffic that doesn't choke itself to death. It's so simple it feels audacious. Don't move the airplanes, move the lane. Angle the landing area. A slight rotation of the stripe on the deck turns a one-way trap into two coordinated flows, a place where a landing can pass by parked planes or a missed approach can simply peel away. Radical? Yes. Obvious, once you see it. And the Navy decides to try it. The Royal Navy actually tried it. They tilted the landing path by just 5 degrees and watched the deck change its behavior. Planes could thread a slanted approach while others sat on the bow, fueled and ready to launch arrivals and departures, no longer sharing the same deadly lane. The experiments were simple, almost elegant. Pilots landed, deck crews shuffled less, launches kept going. It worked. That small angle turned a one-way traffic jam into a manageable flow, a brilliant hint that an old problem might be solved with a tiny, counterintuitive tweak. Then the war ends, and with it the heat that had driven invention. Urgency cools overnight. Budgets are slashed. Admirals swap battle plans for peacetime reports. Men who had been racing deadlines go home to rebuild lives. The angled deck, brilliant in trials, life-saving on paper, slowly fades into bureaucracy. Experiments summarized in memos, sketches tucked into drawers, a painted line relegated to a photo in a file cabinet. It's a cruel irony, an elegant fix waiting for a crisis that no longer exists. For a while the breakthrough sleeps, unbuilt and uncelebrated, its promise preserved only in dusty reports and the memories of a few stubborn engineers. Then came the jets. By 1951, everything the Navy had built for decades, slow, steady prop planes, and a geometry that tolerated mistakes, was suddenly obsolete. These new aircraft were faster, much heavier, and brutal in their demands. Higher approach speeds, shorter reaction windows, and exponentially more destructive energy if something went wrong. A missed wire wasn't just embarrassing anymore. It could punch through parked fueled planes or flip a pilot into the sea. The deck that had once been a forgiving runway became a razor. What had been an inconvenient inefficiency now smelled like catastrophe, and the Navy could no longer afford to wait. Watching the first jets streak in, Commander Walter Wally Boon felt it in his bones, a cold, sudden clarity. These machines were faster, heavier, and far less forgiving than anything naval aviators had known. A missed wire or a bounced landing would no longer be a messy repair. It would be catastrophic. The straight deck that had served for decades now looked perilously narrow, a death trap wrapped in steam and brass. Boone's jaw tightened. This wasn't a maintenance problem. It was a design crisis that could make the carrier obsolete overnight. He left the flight line with one thought: find an answer, and fast. Driven by a new urgency, Boone turns into a man on a mission. Long nights in the archive, coffee cold beside him, stacks of yellowing reports spread like a map. He digs up the British papers on the angled deck, diagrams, test notes, cautious optimism. At first it looks like a half-solved problem, clever parking hacks, a slight cant, a nod toward faster handling. But as he traces their logic, something nags at him. The British had seen a benefit, but not the full promise. They'd sketched a workaround. Boone sees the gap. He sees the possibility they didn't dare imagine. The Brits had treated the canted deck like a clever parking trick. Tilt it a little and you free up space. You shuffle planes faster, fine engineering for convenience. Boone reads those reports and feels a chill. Convenience isn't enough. With jets screaming in and margins measured in seconds and feet, the real problem is survival. One missed wire used to mean fire and chaos. Boone starts to see the angle not as a space saver, but as a safety lane, a way to turn a catastrophic bolter into a routine go-around. It's a small change on paper, but in his head it becomes the difference between life and death and between obsolescence and dominance. He suddenly sees it not a tweak, but a new lane. Tilt the landing strip 8-10 degrees, and the deck stops being a one-way trap. It becomes two-way traffic. Instead of a doomed run into parked aircraft after a missed wire, a pilot can simply power up, roll off the angled edge, and climb out to circle for another try. Short shift, massive consequence. What looked like a paint job becomes a life-saving escape route, a built-in go-around that turns catastrophe into routine procedure. In that instant, Boone knows the angled deck isn't just efficiency, it's survival. This is the eureka moment. Imagine sitting in a jet, low on fuel, staring at a deck you know will become a wall if you miss those wires. Missing them is a bolter, the nightmare every carrier pilot fears. But now the math and geometry change. By angling the landing area, a missed arresting hook stops being a final, fiery sentence and becomes a recoverable mistake. The terror loosens, throats unclench. What was once guaranteed catastrophe is suddenly a tactical non-event. A pilot can miss, power up, and live to try again, turning a once deadly gamble into routine seamanship. Instead of slamming into a crash barricade or plowing into a row of fuel-soaked planes, a pilot who misses the wires simply floors the throttle, the jet roaring down the angled stripe and lifting off the deck. In seconds he's climbing away, clear of parked aircraft, free to circle, and come back a near catastrophe turned into a routine go-around. For decades, a missed wire meant one thing: disaster. Pilots who bolted faced a deck clogged with armed, fueled planes and no way out, a rolling death trap. Now imagine that catastrophe turned into procedure. Angle the landing path a few degrees, and you create a built-in go-around lane. miss the wires, hit the throttle, and you simply peel off and try again. It sounds almost absurdly simple, but the idea reframes the whole problem from an unavoidable fatal flaw to a manageable, repeatable maneuver. Could rotating a runway by 8 or 10 degrees really be the difference between mass casualties and routine safety? In March 1951, Commander Walter Wally Boon lays out a radical pitch. Ditch the heavy shipyard fixes and try something almost absurdly simple. No cutting, no new steel, just paint an angled landing strip and run jets against it. It sounds too small to matter, but that tiny experiment carries the promise of solving a problem that had been killing pilots and crippling carriers. On the massive deck of the USS Midway, they didn't tear anything down. No cranes, no welders, no midnight engineering miracles. They grabbed paint and a protractor and drew an 8-degree stripe across the steel. A new runway angled off to the side. It felt almost comical, a carpenter's solution for a machine-age crisis, and yet it carried everything Boon had promised: a separate path for landing, a place to go if you missed. It was simple, audacious, and cheap. In that single painted line lay the promise of continuous operations and a dramatic test that would either prove it or bury it. The results were immediate and revolutionary. Suddenly, the carrier could do two things at once: catapult planes off the bow while others bled down the new, angled landing lane. Deck crews stopped playing a deadly game of musical chairs. Pilots low on fuel had a fighting chance instead of a prayer. What had been an impossible bottleneck began to dissolve, turning chaos into steady, predictable motion. 90 minutes to 18, the numbers alone read like a miracle, but the real change was the tempo. What had been a stop-and-go death sentence became a smooth, relentless stream. Launches from the bow, recoveries down the angled waist, planes cycling like beats in a drum. Pilots low on fuel suddenly had a fighting chance. Deck crews could turn and reset without choking the runway. Commanders could keep strikes breathing, not pausing. The carrier stopped being a sitting duck and became a rolling empire of air power, able to sustain pressure hour after hour. That shift in tempo didn't just improve efficiency, it dared someone to test it in the air. To prove its life-saving promise, Boon climbed into the cockpit himself. No simulation, no proxy. He taxied to the painted 8-degree landing lane, instruments alive, deck crew holding their breath. He lined up on that slanted striped nose steady, throttle primed, every eye on his jet. What he was about to attempt would either vindicate the idea or doom it. There was no middle ground. Wally Boon lined up on the painted lane, the carrier a low, trembling horizon beneath his jet. He aimed deliberately high, too high on purpose. The arresting wires flashed under him, and he knew he would miss them. No panic, no frantic corrections. He calmly shoved the throttle forward. The engine bit. The jet didn't crash into a barricade or plow through parked, fueled aircraft. It ate the angled deck, climbed, and cleared the bow. He pulled away, engines howling, to circle and come around again. In one controlled motion, the terrifying bolter was turned into a safe, routine go-around. His jet roared off the angled edge of the deck, turbine howl cutting through the spray as the nose climbed and the little plane slid safely back into the sky to circle and try again. What had been a catastrophe, a missed wire, a crashed recovery, a blocked deck had just been turned into a routine go-around. In a single, breathless moment, the math changed. A bolter no longer meant death for pilot or ship, it meant another chance. The paint had proved the idea. The deck's deadliest failure point was exposed as solvable. The catch, making that painted line the fleet's reality, would be an enormous engineering fight. The painted stripe was brilliant in its simplicity, proof that a new geometry could save lives, but taking that single stroke from experiment to every carrier in the fleet was nothing like painting a line. It was a full-scale revolt against decades of naval architecture. Every component, every deck plan, every winch and wire had been arranged for a straight, centerline world, and now engineers had to reimagine ships from the flight deck down. Steel had to be cut and added, arresting gear realigned, storage and fueling patterns rewritten, and entire procedures retrained across crews who'd known only one way to operate. Retrofitting wasn't just paint and prayer. It meant gutting the ship. The island, the carrier's nerve center, had to be lifted, moved, and redesigned so landing paths and arresting gear aligned with the new angle. That meant rerouting elevators, controls, and power, shifting weight, and reworking communications. Cranes, welders, and naval architects worked non-stop, all to make room for a massive sponson bolted to the port side. To carve the angled runway into existing ships, they welded a massive steel sponson onto the port side, essentially a new chunk of deck jutting out, heavy as a small house. It meant cutting, welding, reinforcing bulkheads, shifting weights, and rebalancing the ship, painstaking work in yards and dry docks. That sponson made the angled runway real and paved the way to rebuild the arresting gear to the new geometry. They didn't just tweak the deck, they gutted it. Every arresting engine, cable drum, and hydraulic absorber had to be ripped out, realigned, and rebuilt to fit the new angle, foundations relaid and machinery repositioned to catch jets coming in on a slant. It wasn't a retrofit. It was a complete reconstruction that turned carriers into floating shipyards for weeks. But that enormous rebuild turned out to be an opportunity in disguise. While yards cut, welded, and shifted islands, the Navy quietly installed a new kind of muscle. Powerful steam catapults, long, brutal, and precise. Suddenly carriers could fling much heavier jets into the air. The angled deck wasn't just a geometric fix anymore. It rode on raw power and a smarter flight deck. With the decks rebuilt came a new muscle, steam catapults powerful enough to fling the heavy, fast jets that had exposed the straight deck's limits in the first place. It wasn't just a retrofit. It was a marriage of solutions. The angled landing lane let a missed arresting wire become a safe go-around, and the catapult gave those jets the shove they needed to fly off a much heavier, faster world. The two technologies fed each other, unlocking a rhythm of simultaneous launches and recoveries that had been impossible before. That synergy is what would be tested in combat next, when theory finally met fire. 1952, the painted line becomes a battlefield experiment. The converted USS Antietam sails into the Korea fight, her waist deck now angled, her crews nervously proud, pilots clutching throttles that now mean life or death. This is no peacetime demo. It's the ultimate trial. Can a simple tilt of steel and paint survive the chaos of combat, launches and recoveries under fire, damaged planes and tight fuel tanks? For the Navy, everything now hinges on the answer. The combat data flowed in, and it was decisive. The Antietam was launching an astonishing 74% more sorties than the straight-deck ships operating in the same theater. That number wasn't abstract, it translated into more strikes on target, more pilots getting a second and third go at a mission, and far fewer aircraft being forced into the sea while their crews prayed for rescue. Sortie tempo went from fits and starts to a relentless, sustained rhythm. Deck crews moved from crisis management to routine efficiency. In short, the angled deck turned a crippling bottleneck into continuous power projection, and the numbers left no room for doubt. The numbers paint a stark picture of readiness. For a pilot threading the pattern toward a straight-deck carrier, returning was literally a coin flip, a 50/50 chance the deck below would actually be clear and ready. Imagine burning fuel, altitude bleeding away, every gauge a countdown, while the ship below is a roulette of parked planes, bombs, and fuel. One snapped wire, one blown tire, and that runway becomes a wall. Pilots learn to do two jobs at once: fly the plane and calculate the odds. It was the difference between a routine trap and the dark possibility of ditching in cold Pacific water. Think about what those numbers mean in a cockpit where every second burns fuel and judgment. A straight-deck carrier gave you roughly a coin flip chance. Your deck would be clear when you came home 50/50. And that's not math, it's a verdict. The Antietam's jump to 79% changed that calculus. Suddenly, damaged planes could be recovered instead of ditched. Pilots with gas needles grazing empty had a fighting chance to hook a wire instead of becoming a blip on a rescue beacon. It wasn't just efficiency on a spreadsheet. It was lives saved, crews kept whole, and a carrier that could keep fighting. Men below watched, and they knew they'd seen something that mattered. Lieutenant James Miker saw the math turn into moments of mercy. Numbers on a report meant nothing until he watched it play out. Battered fighters slicing low, a pilot nursing a damaged airframe, a plane with a live bomb trundling to a halt, each recovered without the deck turning into a killing field. Throttles opened. Missed hooks became routine bolters, power up and go, not catastrophe. Crews moved with calm purpose. Miker felt it in his chest. The angled deck was saving people, not just sorties. In the chaos of combat, what had been lethal disorder now ran with an almost surgical grace. Smoke-streaked fighters thud toward the deck-ripped flaps, sparking hydraulics, a bomber limping in, with a live bomb still stuck beneath its belly, while rain and low clouds jostle a disoriented pilot into a tense, white-knuckle approach. On the angled deck, choreography replaces chaos. Deck crews slide into position, arresting wires bite, and pilots throttle up for a clean go-around when needed. One damaged plane is trundled clear. The next is corralled and winched down. Another simply powers off the edge and comes back around. What should have been a string of disasters instead becomes a parade of recoveries, battle-damaged aircraft, unexploded ordnance, and all brought in, one after another. Miker watches the deck like a man watching a miracle unfold. Planes that would once have spelled catastrophe now come down one after another, battered but whole, pilots climbing out of cockpits that should have been torn apart. He sees the terror in a radio call turn into relief as a jet that missed the wire simply powers up and flies again. He feels it in the tightened faces of deck crews turning to smiles, in the hush that replaces panic when a damaged bomber slides to a stop instead of detonating a chain reaction. This painted line didn't just speed operations, it bought seconds. And those seconds are lives, and the proof is coming. By March 1953, the evidence was impossible to ignore. The Antietam was averaging 89 sorties a day, while straight-deck carriers were barely scraping together 47. That gap wasn't abstract. Every extra sortie was another strike on the enemy, another damaged plane brought home, another pilot who walked back from a landing that would have been fatal on a clogged deck. Efficiency turned into survivability. The math spoke louder than doctrine. The angled deck didn't just speed things up, it rewrote what a carrier could do in combat. Those numbers left little room for argument, and they set the stage for a report that would change naval aviation forever. The Antietam's captain files a report that reads like a verdict. The angled deck boosted his ship's striking power by at least 85%. Not a tweak, but a transformation. Numbers that used to be argued over now slam shut the debate. The math is brutal, the lives saved obvious, and the tactical advantage undeniable. Skeptics lose their talking points overnight as squadron commanders and admirals stare at sortie logs and fuel manifests and see a new reality. This isn't theory anymore, it's combat-proven performance, and with that hard proof, the Navy can no longer stall. A decision is coming. The Korean combat stats didn't whisper, they shouted. Faced with clear, battlefield-proven numbers, the Navy stopped tinkering and chose transformation. Not a patch or a trial, but a wholesale change in carrier doctrine. Future carriers would be built around a different geometry, and shipyards were ordered to bend steel and rethink everything that rode on that deck. The goal was simple and brutal: turn a one-shot recovery cycle into continuous air operations, erase the deck's fatal choke point, and make an enemy's window of opportunity vanish. It was a technical decision, but its consequences were geopolitical. A shift that would reshape naval power for decades to come. The Navy didn't tinker at the edges, it rewrote the carrier's DNA. The Forrestal class was born not as a retrofit, but as a purpose-built machine centered on that simple, life-saving tilt. The angled deck became the organizing principle, not an afterthought. Every bulkhead, elevator, and wiring run was planned around uninterrupted airflow. The island, the catapults, the hangar, all designed to keep jets launching while others landed. What had once been a fragile 90-minute choke point was now engineered out of existence, trading downtime for relentless tempo and turning a single ship into a continuous, floating airbase starting with the USS Forrestal. On the new USS Forrestal, everything is optimized for this new geometry of continuous operations. The flight deck stopped behaving like a single fragile runway and started operating like a living machine. Launches from the bow, recoveries on the angled waist, crews moving with rehearsed precision, catapults, arresting wires, elevators, and parking zones were repositioned and reinforced so one movement never halted the next. Jets streamed off in steady waves, while others landed and were turned around in minutes. The carrier stopped being a choke point and became an endless airbase at sea, an engineering solution that immediately rewrote naval strategy and demanded sweeping changes to the island and launch systems. On the new Forrestal, everything was rethought around that diagonal runway. The island was pushed far aft, so deck officers and pilots could actually see the whole landing picture, and 4 brutal steam catapults were wired into the ship like pistons, powerful enough to fling heavy jets into the sky in rapid succession, while recovery ops continued down the angled waist. Planes launched. Planes landed. No pause, no deadly logjam. What had been a stop-and-wait nightmare became a continuous conveyor of air power, a carrier that could breathe fire and never run out of breath. Suddenly, the carrier became something else. Not a ship that paused between strikes, but a continuous machine of air power. The frantic stop-start of recovery vanished. Landings and launches could happen at once. A missed wire no longer turned the deck into a death trap. That single flaw, the one that had forced commanders to choose between launching and recovering, was gone, and doctrine shifted with it. Commanders could sustain pressure, keep fighters in the sky, and deny enemies any predictable window to hit them. In short, the angled deck converted a fragile episodic weapon into an almost unstoppable, always-ready airbase at sea, one the world would have to reckon with. Soviet Admiral Sergei Gorskov saw it and admitted it plainly. The balance had tilted. NATO carriers were no longer vulnerable in brief, exploitable moments. They could keep aircraft aloft and strikes flowing without pause. That meant something simple and terrifying. A carrier stopped being a single-use weapon and became a mobile, persistent fortress. A flying airbase that could hold a theater, under constant pressure. For the Soviets, that erased the window of opportunity they'd always relied on. Strategy had to change overnight. What had started as a painted line on a deck had become a geopolitical game-changer, forcing every navy to reckon with continuous, unblinking power projection. By 1959, 4 Forrestal-class supercarriers are sailing the oceans, each packing the punch of 3 World War II carriers, and in a few short years the calculus of naval warfare has been rewritten. There is no longer a predictable window to strike, no easy choke point for an enemy to exploit. Fleets that once hunted carriers now hesitate because a single supercarrier can launch, recover, and sustain air power almost endlessly. The balance of power tips away from massed battleships toward these floating airfields, and with that shift comes an uncomfortable truth: global reach, sustained and unblinking, belongs to whoever controls the deck. For over 70 years, that simple geometric tweak, the angled deck paired with steam catapults and an offset island, has been the quiet backbone of carrier power, the standard every navy in the world adopted, because it actually worked. It turned a one-off fix into an industry-wide doctrine. Let carriers launch and recover at once, rescued pilots who would otherwise have gone into the sea, and multiplied a fleet's striking tempo so dramatically that whole strategies had to be rewritten. It's a rare design that survives every leap in aircraft technology. This one did. And that survival tells you something about how the right idea, however small, can remap the balance of power. Even on the world's most advanced carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, bristling with electromagnetic catapults and stealthy systems, one humble detail endures: the basic 8-degree angled deck. That small tilt, born from a painted line and a test pilot willing to risk a bolter, didn't just shave minutes off a recovery cycle, it removed the single deadliest failure point in naval aviation, turned chaos into a steady stream of sorties, and quite literally saved lives. Decades of shiny new tech have come and gone, but that simple geometric shift remains, a reminder that elegant, low-tech solutions can outlast the flashiest innovations, and maybe the next impossible problem only needs a new angle. It is a testament to a perfectly solved problem, an elegant solution that has stood the test of time and maybe contactions. Technology. A single painted line, turned into hard steel and steam, erased the carrier's deadliest blind spot, doubled its strike tempo, and turned chaotic recoveries into routine operations. Generations of pilots, sailors, and shipbuilders have relied on that angled deck. Even the most advanced carriers today still keep the same 8-degree compromise between risk and possibility. Commander Boon's quiet insight saved lives and rewrote naval strategy, a reminder that the smartest fixes are often simple shifts in perspective, and that small changes can change history. Commander Boon's elegant insight, a simple rotation of a landing strip, did more than tweak a deck. It doubled a carrier's striking power, removed the single deadliest failure point in naval aviation, and, quite literally, rewrote the rules of sea power for generations. What looks like a cosmetic stripe of paint became the hinge on which strategy swung. Efficiency turned into survivability, and paralysis into relentless, continuous flight operations. It's a reminder that the biggest leaps sometimes start with the smallest changes, courage to look at an old problem from a different angle, and the nerve to paint a new line. What modern impossible problem could be solved with that same shift in perspective?